I didn't realize that everything would go into the attack. But as soon as my little boy closed the doors to the toilet and stretched as far as I could to the stitch on my cloth, I realized that there was no way back. His father was sitting just a few meters away from us, and I stood on the border of the greatest mercy of my life. You won't believe what happened. I never expected that one ordinary morning would shift everything. I was still wrapping the steam of my shower around me as I stepped into the quiet corridor of our home, a place I had traversed countless times without incident. But today, something felt off. I could sense eyes on me before I even turned my head. There he stood, Ethan, Richard's son from his previous marriage, looking at me in a way I hadn't seen before. I recalled him as a boy, awkward and unsure, yet today he was a man. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, every movement precise. I felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable in my damp robe. I tried to move past him, my mind blank, unaware of what I was about to trigger. Sorry, I mumbled, attempting to sidestep him and reclaim a sense of privacy. His response halted me in my tracks. Slowly, deliberately, he scanned me as if he were evaluating every detail. "You shouldn't hide," he said, his tone steady and direct. "You're incredible." I froze. His words were simple, but they ignited a spark inside me, a spark I thought had long been extinguished. I could feel a heat rising in my cheeks, my heart beginning to pound in a way that made my limbs feel almost unresponsive. I didn't know what to say. Instead of engaging further, I turned sharply and retreated to my room, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the doorframe. Inside my room, I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, trying to slow my racing thoughts. I knew that my marriage to Richard had grown predictable, even stale. Our days had fallen into a routine devoid of passion. I had been his faithful wife for so long that the idea of my own desires had become a distant, nearly forgotten echo. Yet, Iffin's unexpected compliment had stirred something within me, a yearning for acknowledgement, for vitality, for the excitement I once knew. Every minute that passed in the silence of my room, the image of his confident gaze burned in my mind. I couldn't help but replay the encounter. The way he had spoken with an assurance that belied his age, the slight tilt of his head as he studied me, and that directness that both unnerved and intrigued me. I was aware that the boundaries of our relationship were defined long ago. He was the son of my husband, not someone I was meant to be drawn to. And yet, in that charged moment, those boundaries blurred into uncertainty. I set my trembling hands on the quilt and tried to steady my breathing, forcing my mind to focus on the rational parts of myself. I was a loyal wife, a dependable woman in a secure marriage. But his words had shattered that calm facade. They hinted at a hidden desire I had long suppressed. It was not just the compliment, it was the way it was delivered. There was an invitation in his tone that I hadn't expected. It was as if he was daring me to acknowledge a part of myself that I had buried under years of monotony. After a long silence, I forced myself to rise and head towards the living area where Richard was reading the morning paper, unaware of the turmoil inside me. I kept my eyes low and my thoughts jumbled, but I knew I needed to prepare for the inevitable collision of two very different worlds. The stable, predictable life I had built with Richard was now intersecting with the unpredictability of desire and temptation. Every step I took was a reminder of the choice I was unknowingly making, one that would eventually reshape my reality. Later that day, as I moved through the routine of my chores and small interactions with Richard, the memory of that encounter haunted me. It was more than just a physical attraction. It was an emotional awakening. I found myself questioning every aspect of my life, the lack of passion in my marriage, the comfort of my routine, and the possibility that I might be craving something more daring, something that challenged my expectations. I recalled the clear lines of my previous understanding. I was the devoted wife, the supportive partner. Now, those roles felt constricted. I couldn't shake the feeling that the glimpse of admiration in Ethan's eyes was both an invitation and a provocation, a call to awaken parts of me that I had long suppressed. His unexpected presence in our home was a catalyst, setting off a chain reaction I wasn't sure I could control. That evening, as the day's events settled into a subdued quiet, I sat by the window, the dimming light casting long shadows across the room. I stared out, trying to piece together what this encounter meant for me. There were no immediate answers, only the weight of a decision I was not ready to face. I knew one thing for certain. My life was no longer the same. The balance between duty and desire had been irreversibly altered. In that moment, as I listened to the soft hum of the night outside, I understood that I was standing at the edge of something dangerous, yet undeniable. The simple encounter in the corridor had shattered the illusion of safety in my everyday life. And although I wasn't ready to confront the implications, I also couldn't deny that I had been awakened. My heart was still racing from his words, a mixture of fear, excitement, and an inescapable curiosity about where this new, uncharted path might lead. And so, as I prepared for the uncertain night ahead, I acknowledged a truth I could no longer ignore. The temptation was real, and it had already begun to unravel the fabric of my carefully constructed world. That evening, I settled into the living room with a book, trying to lose myself in its pages. The quiet was a welcome escape from the day's earlier tension. Suddenly, I heard soft footsteps approaching. I looked up as Ethan entered, carrying 2 glasses of wine. He placed one of them on the table beside me and said, "I thought you needed some company." I reached for the glass, my hand trembling so slightly that I hoped it went unnoticed. I took a measured sip, the wine doing little to steady the unease in my chest. For a few minutes, our conversation remained light, punctuated by small comments about the day. The casual tone made it easy to forget, if only for a moment, the unsettling encounter from that morning. Without warning, Ethan shifted the topic. His next words cut through the comfortable pretense. "Have you ever wanted to try something forbidden?" he asked, his tone low and deliberate. I paused, startled by the abrupt change. My mind raced, trying to decide whether this was a flirtatious jest or something more calculated. "Why do you ask?" I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. He leaned in closer, reducing the distance between us until I could sense the warmth of his breath. "Because I see it in your eyes," he replied softly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of challenge. His gaze was unwavering, and every word he spoke seemed to force my guarded thoughts to the surface. There was no time to dwell. Ethan's next words came with an unexpected intensity. "Have you ever truly longed to feel desired?" His question was not merely conversational, it was an invitation to confront a desire I had long suppressed. The room's ambient noise faded into the background, leaving only the sound of his measured speech and the rapid beating of my own heart. The weight of his inquiry pressed on me. I remembered the safe, predictable rhythm of my life with Richard, a life that had grown comfortable but ultimately stifling. The audacity of Ethan's question unsettled that calm, threatening to disrupt everything I had built. My instincts screamed caution, yet a part of me couldn't help but be drawn to the possibility of something more, something dangerously enticing. I realized then that this was not a mere attempt at conversation. Each word, each deliberate pause, was meant to chip away at the boundaries I had carefully constructed over years. I glanced at the untouched wine, feeling the room shrink around the charged silence between us. The easy veneer of our earlier talk was gone, replaced by a tension that made every sound, every soft inflection in his voice, impossible to ignore. Determined not to give in, I set the glass down with a firm clink on the table. I couldn't let this conversation push me any further into territory where logic and loyalty were at risk. Rising abruptly, I announced, "I'm going to sleep," my tone leaving no room for negotiation. I turned to leave, each step deliberate, trying to distance myself from the magnetic pull of his presence. Over my shoulder, I heard him calmly remark, "You'll still be thinking about it." His words, understated yet penetrating, trailed after me as I made my way to my bedroom. As I closed the door behind me, I could still hear the soft echo of his voice mingling with the silence. The living room, now a distant memory, seemed to hold the promise of unresolved tension. In the solitude of my room, I lay on the bed, unable to quickly dismiss the impact of what had transpired. Every nuance of Ethan's tone, every carefully chosen word, replayed in my mind like a persistent refrain. Even as sleep beckoned, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. His subtle manipulations had planted a seed, a reminder that the life I knew was no longer impenetrable to temptation. My body remembered each sound, each intonation, as if they were physical imprints that would not fade with time. That night, As the darkness deepened around me, I realized that his parting words were more than a fleeting comment. They were a promise that the night's events would linger in my thoughts long after I had closed my eyes, a reminder that the line between duty and desire had blurred, leaving me with an inescapable sense of uncertainty. The next day, I found myself in the kitchen early, the routine of making coffee a welcome distraction from the whirlwind of emotions that had overtaken me recently. I measured out the grounds, filled the kettle, and set everything in motion with practiced precision. The quiet hum of the coffee maker and the familiar clink of ceramic against porcelain usually brought comfort, but today, there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. As I reached for my favorite mug, I suddenly became aware of another presence in the room. I didn't need to turn around to know he was there. His footsteps were deliberate, echoing softly on the tiled floor behind me. Before I could register the intrusion, a voice, smooth yet provocatively casual, broke through my thoughts. Have you never been curious about what it's like with a younger man? The words were directed at me, a question that cut through the normalcy of my morning like a shard of glass. I whirled around, startled. There, leaning casually against the counter, stood Ethan. His expression was one of amused confidence, his eyes gleaming with mischief as though he had been waiting for the precise moment to make his move. The tone of his question left little room for interpretation. It was a challenge, a tease that hinted at forbidden possibilities. For a heartbeat, I was frozen, caught between shock and an inexplicable pull. Ethan, stop. I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. My words were almost lost amid the sudden burst of his laughter. He chuckled lightly, the sound echoing in the small space of the kitchen as he shrugged off my protest with a casual nonchalance that both infuriated and intrigued me. You can push me away as much as you want, he said steadily, stepping a bit closer, but your eyes say otherwise. There was an undeniable certainty in his tone, as if he had seen through every facade I had built around myself. His words, delivered with an ease that belied their impact, seemed to peel away layers of pretense. In that charged moment, I noticed something in his gaze, a mixture of defiance and allure that made it impossible to dismiss him outright. I felt his hand, light as a whisper, brush against my wrist. It was a fleeting touch, yet it carried an intensity that made my skin prick up with awareness. The contact was brief, but its effect was immediate. I took a step back, my pulse quickening not just from the physical sensation but from the realization of how deeply his presence was affecting me. His nearness was both dangerous and irresistible, a paradox I wasn't sure I could resolve. Without waiting for my response, Ethan leaned even closer, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial murmur. You like it, don't you? He asked, his question hanging in the air like a charged secret. I didn't have the words to reply. Instead, I turned sharply and left the kitchen, each step measured and deliberate, as I tried to distance myself from the magnetic pull of his bold advances. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through my motions, attending meetings, returning emails, and managing the responsibilities that defined my orderly life. Yet, every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lingering in the background. His audacity had unsettled me, leaving a residue of disquiet that I couldn't quite shake off. That evening, as darkness settled and the world outside grew quiet, I found a brief moment of solitude in my bedroom. I lay down, attempting to let sleep claim me, but the events of the day swirled in my mind. Every word, every gesture from Ethan replayed with unnerving clarity. I could still feel the subtle pressure of his hand, his teasing smile, and the unspoken promise embedded in his eyes. As I lay there in the dim light, I struggled with a growing awareness of how easily my carefully constructed boundaries had been breached. I recalled the sharpness in my own voice as I commanded him to stop, the reflexive anger that had surged through me. And yet, underneath that anger was an undeniable thrill, a dangerous curiosity about what his boldness might lead to if I allowed it to. The tension was palpable, a silent game that both of us were playing. His challenge had left me unsettled, questioning the familiar patterns of my life. I wasn't just reacting to a provocative question. I was confronting a part of myself that had long been dormant, a desire for something uncharted, a hunger for risk that had been masked by years of routine. Now, as the night deepened, I realized that I was no longer immune to his advances. His brazen challenge had left an imprint that I couldn't erase with mere determination or discipline. Despite my best efforts to dismiss it, my thoughts continuously circled back to him, the way he had looked at me, the audacity of his question, and the thrill of that fleeting touch. In that quiet darkness, I acknowledged a troubling truth. The game had just begun, and I was already entangled in its dangerous allure. My mind raced with the implications of his words, each thought more perilous than the last. There was no simple escape from what I had felt today. As I finally drifted toward a restless sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring, and whether I was ready to face the consequences of this dangerous game. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner in my own quiet way, when Richard entered with his usual air of confidence. He paused at the doorway, his eyes alight with a secret amusement as he began unbuttoning the cuffs of his shirt. "I have a surprise," he announced with a smile that hinted at excitement and mischief. I frowned slightly, still processing his sudden change in demeanor. "What surprise?" I asked, my tone betraying more curiosity than I intended. With a sparkle in his eyes, he replied, "We're flying on vacation. First class, a luxury resort, everything the best for my wife." His tone was cheerful, as if he expected this news to bring only joy. I felt the pressure to smile, to share his enthusiasm, yet my thoughts were tangled with another secret worry. Despite his excitement, all I could think about was Ethan, knowing he, too, would be joining us on this trip. Forcing a smile, I responded, "That's great, Richard." My voice was steady, but inside I was already bracing myself for the inevitable collision of two worlds. As I said my line, I became aware of another presence. I sensed a shift in the atmosphere, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of Ethan standing in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. Ethan's eyes met mine for a brief moment, and with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he said, "Interesting, just the two of you?" His voice was low and teasing, laced with an insinuation that I couldn't ignore. Richard, ever the picture of normality, chimed in without missing a beat. "You're flying with us too, son." His tone was light, as if announcing a matter-of-fact family arrangement. Ethan's slight smile deepened, and he added quietly, "Oh, this will be unforgettable." The words hung in the air, and I felt a prickling tension that I tried to ignore as I finished my chores. Later that evening, in the solitude of my bedroom, I began to pack my things for the trip. I moved methodically, folding clothes and arranging essentials, trying to focus on the practical rather than the emotional. But then, I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of the bedroom door closing. It wasn't the familiar creak of a door settling. It was measured, almost calculated. I paused in the middle of packing, my hands hovering over a neatly folded blouse, and turned towards the sound. There, standing by the door with his hands tucked into his pockets, was Ethan. His posture was relaxed, yet radiated an air of bold confidence, and his eyes shone with a playful, challenging gleam. "Seems like you're not very excited about the trip," he remarked, his tone casual, yet edged with a provocative insinuation. I met his gaze, my voice firm despite the turbulent thoughts swirling inside me. "I'm tired, Ethan," I replied curtly, my words meant to shut down any further intrusion. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Or maybe you're afraid to be so close to me for so many days?" he asked, his tone almost taunting. I clenched my teeth at his audacity. "Not funny," I said sharply, trying to regain control of the situation. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against my shoulder as he let his hand slide down my arm. The touch was brief, but it was loaded with unspoken implications, a physical challenge that left an unmistakable mark on my skin. "Tell me that you don't want this, and I will back off," he murmured, his voice low and compelling as if daring me to defy him. I inhaled slowly, struggling to steady myself, to let his touch go unnoticed by my resolve. But even as I tried to compose myself, his presence pressed upon me. Without giving me a moment to gather my thoughts, he leaned in even closer. "We'll be far from here. No rules. No control. Just you and me," he whispered, his words a promise of a dangerous freedom that resonated deep within me. In that charged moment, his lips nearly brushed against my neck. Instinctively, I closed my eyes, a reflex meant to block out the overwhelming reality of his nearness. At the very last second, I pushed him away. Go, Ethan, I commanded, my voice cold and unyielding. He paused, taking a long, measured breath while his eyes remained fixed on mine. For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft hum of the overhead light. Finally, he spoke, his tone devoid of any further persuasion. On the plane, you will understand that you made a mistake. His words were quiet but echoed with an unsettling certainty before he turned and left the room without another word. Left alone, I stood in the center of the room, trying to steady myself. I moved to the window and looked out at the darkened street, seeking solace in the distance. Every detail of his touch, his tone, his challenge replayed in my mind like a stubborn refrain. I attempted to calm the storm of thoughts, but it was clear that the encounter had unsettled me far beyond a passing moment of rebellion or excitement. In that lonely silence, I realized that tonight, I wasn't just preparing for a family vacation, I was facing one final trial, a moment that forced me to confront the dangerous allure of something forbidden. The unanswered questions about Ethan's intentions and my own vulnerabilities lingered in the space around me, leaving me to wonder how much of this journey would be defined by my choices and how much by the unpredictable actions of someone who refused to let boundaries remain intact. First class. Silence. Richard sits beside me, absorbed in his magazine, while Ethan occupies the seat across the aisle, his smile, a smile I've grown to despise, fixed on me. The cabin hums with quiet efficiency, punctuated only by the occasional announcement and the soft clink of cutlery from the galley. I lean back in my seat, trying to focus on the scenery beyond the window, but my mind replays the turmoil that has defined the past few days. A flight attendant appears, offering a tray of champagne. With a subtle nod, Ethan lifts his glass and, in a voice barely above a whisper, declares, "For new discoveries." His words drift over to me, charged with an insinuation I cannot ignore. I force a smile and take a sip from my own glass, yet all the while, I feel his eyes on me, a gaze that carries memories of earlier, more confrontational moments. I watch the clouds scud by, lost in thought, when suddenly I feel a light, almost imperceptible touch on my knee. It's Ethan, his hand brushing against me as if testing boundaries. I recoil instantly, pushing my leg away as if to reclaim a sense of personal space. Ethan's smile lingers, undeterred by my reaction. "Did you ever dream about this?" he asks, his tone teasing as he leans forward slightly. "About what?" I reply, my voice measured, though I feel a twinge of anger and disbelief welling up inside me. "About sex on a plane," he continues, his voice low and laced with mischief. His words, so brazen in their delivery, make my cheeks burn. "Ethan, don't you dare." I begin, but he cuts me off by leaning in even closer, his intent unmistakable. "I'm waiting for you there," he murmurs, nodding subtly in the direction of the lavatory. For a moment, time seems to pause in the cramped space of the cabin. I know I should remain seated, ignore the invitation, and cling to the familiar, safe routine of my life. Yet as the minutes tick by, something inside me shifts. The conflict between duty and desire, between loyalty and a yearning for something forbidden, weighs heavily on my mind. I should have stayed in my seat, ignored the silent provocation. I should have clung to the structure of my predictable life. But the tension is too palpable, the allure too dangerous. After several long minutes of agonizing indecision, I rise from my seat. My movements are cautious, deliberate. I make my way down the narrow aisle toward the lavatory, each step resonating with a mix of determination and trepidation. When I reach the lavatory door, I push it open quietly and step inside. There, waiting for me, is Ethan. His eyes burn with an intensity that leaves little room for negotiation. Without a word, he locks the door behind me, as if sealing our fate. "I knew you would come," he says, his tone a blend of satisfaction and something darker, a promise of what might come. I stand there, silent, as he moves closer. He doesn't rush or demand. Instead, he approaches with a slow, deliberate certainty. His hand reaches out and grazes my neck, not forcefully, but with an unmistakable intention to push boundaries further. "Give me this moment," he whispers, his breath warm as his lips nearly touch my skin. Before I can muster a response, His hands find the zipper on my dress. I can't deny the shock at the invasion of my personal space, the realization that this moment is irrevocable. My fingers, almost automatically, come into contact with his chest in a futile attempt to regain control, to halt the momentum building between us. Then, in an instant, the spell is broken. I step back sharply, the air between us charged with the sudden clarity of my own resolve. No, I say firmly, my words slicing through the charged silence. Ethan's eyes widen in surprise. What? He asks, his voice betraying a hint of disbelief. This is a mistake, I state, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. I lift my dress quickly, my hands trembling as I restore the boundaries that had begun to crumble. For a heartbeat, he stands there, processing my rejection. Really? And you decide that only now, he challenges, a mixture of amusement and incredulity in his tone. I can only nod, unable to fully articulate the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Yes, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. He laughs softly, a sound devoid of genuine mirth. Do you think you can forget after this? He taunts, his eyes searching mine for some sign of regret or wavering desire. I meet his gaze steadily. I can't forget, I reply, the truth settling in my bones. I have to live with it. His expression hardens as he sighs, running a hand through his hair with a frustrated motion. You ruined the moment, Linda, he says, his words sharp with accusation. I inhale deeply, feeling the weight of his verdict. I ruined everything, I whisper, the confession more to myself than to him. Without another word, I open the door and retreat back to my seat. The air in the cabin seems colder now, the silence heavier. I sink back into my seat, my breathing uneven, the encounter leaving me shaken. Richard looks up from his magazine, his voice laced with concern. Everything okay? I glance at him, the reality of our shared life colliding with the chaos of the last few moments. And then, in a flash of painful clarity, I understand. No, Richard. Nothing is okay, I say, reaching out to take his hand. We need to talk, I continue, my voice trembling as I confront the irreversible truth. Richard's face changes immediately, the pleasant veneer dissolving into worry. What happened? He asks quietly. I close my eyes, unable to hide the truth any longer. This concerns Ethan and me. Richard sets his magazine aside, his expression unreadable as he braces himself for what comes next. In that moment, as I stare down the consequences of my choices, I know that there is no turning back. The path ahead is uncertain, and the life I once knew is now irreparably changed. The finality of that realization settles over me like a weight. The road back is lost, and all that remains is the uncharted territory of a future defined by this fateful decision.